Let me read from the passage that we're looking at today. It's Galatians chapter 5, just reading from verses 13 to 15. This is the word of God. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Amen. I have an affliction. It's hereditary. It generally affects the males in my family more than the females. It's when we hear the word freedom, we tend to go full William Wallace. Have you seen the film Braveheart? There's a famous speech when Wallace is addressing the Scots as they come up against the English. Sons of Scotland, I am William Wallace. I'm going to paraphrase a little. And I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny. You have come to fight as free men, and free men you are. What would you do with that freedom? Will you fight? The Scots then talk amongst each other and question the sense in doing that, and some of them want to run away to live. And Wallace replies, "Aye, fight and you may die. Run and you'll live, at least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our," I can almost hear you saying it, "freedom"? This letter of Paul is to a church or churches that came into being after Paul had proclaimed the gospel. But in a relatively short space of time, the churches had been infiltrated by false teachers, convincing these new believers of a false gospel. And so in this letter, while there's a level of chastisement with Paul telling the Galatians off, he says, "O foolish Galatians," at the start of chapter 3. There's also in this book a lot of reasons why they should return to the true gospel. The overall theme of the letter is that through Jesus' death, they are part of the new covenant. They don't need to become Jews. They don't need to follow the outward ceremonies of the Mosaic law. You know, the law from the Old Testament that God gave to the Israelites through Moses. It's different now. It's not about obedience to the law. It's about faith. It's about living in the guidance and power of the Spirit. And while we're not a church in Galatia, we are, of course, part of the new covenant. And perhaps even more than ever, we need to be aware of false gospels around us. So there's much in this letter for us. In this short section we're looking at today, the message follows the logic of a number of statements. And we're going to look at each of those as we work through the verses. First, Paul restates the foundation of the Christian life. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Then based on that call from God, there follows, I guess, a command in two parts. What we should not do with that freedom. Do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. And what we should do, serve one another humbly in love. And then he provides a two-part incentive to support this two-part command in a positive way. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. And then, much more negatively, if you don't do this, if you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. And as we continue in our One Another series, the main point of this short passage is, through love, be servants of one another. Through love, be servants of one another. First, let's think about freedom. This call to be free in verse 13. People today demand freedom. Freedom to do what they want. Freedom from any kind of criticism. Freedom to feel comfortable about their sin. Freedom to not only be tolerated, but freedom to be celebrated. This is our culture today. Freedom of how people express their gender, their sexuality, freedom of choice when it comes to what a mother can decide to do with an unborn child. And some of this culture has infiltrated some churches today. It's hard to believe, it's hard to stomach, but some expressions of the church are normalizing and celebrating and affirming how people identify themselves, their views on who can be married, and freedom to abort an unborn child. We need to be alert to those promoting these freedoms as a false gospel. Never mind the likes of the prosperity gospel. But even way back in the time of the judges, we read of the Israelites, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Is not what we see today. People doing whatever they want. But that's not what is meant by freedom. When Paul was writing to the Galatians, you were called to be free. It doesn't mean free from the commands of God, or free from the will of God, the law of God, or free from God's moral law. So what are we free from? In chapter 3, verse 13, Paul says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. By Christ dying for us, he has freed us from condemnation. Paul also says in this book that we're free from Old Testament rituals and ceremonies that were designed for Israel. Very important at that time to, on an external basis, separate them from other people. But we are free from that because all those rituals have been set aside. They were symbolic. They were shadowing what was to come. So when Paul talks about freedom, it's a freedom from the curse of the law, a freedom from the bondage of sin, free from the penalty of sin, free from what we deserve, free from the Old Testament's complex ceremonies and rituals. It was these latter things that the Jews had come to Galatia to try and impose on these new believing Galatians who weren't Jews. To summarize, freedom for the Christian, the freedom we have is freedom from sin and death and hell and all those external religious things. Let us rejoice in that. But let us be careful as well. We're not free to indulge the flesh, as Paul warns here. What is meant by flesh in verse 13? In this context, the Greek word for flesh refers to the sinful state of our humanity. If you have been born again, you are a new creation, but we still live in these bodies with the same desires and facing the same temptations. We still have a battle going on. Later on in verse 17, Paul talks about the opposition between the flesh and the spirit. And verse 19 tells us what the acts of the flesh are: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. And while it's easy for us to look at the world and even to look at some churches who have got things wrong and criticize them, I wonder if we need to look at ourselves, because in this list is included hatred, jealousy, fits of rage, dissensions, factions, and envy. And by the way, it's not a complete list because it's left open with "and the like" at the end. But even all of those things that are listed, is there hatred in you? Is there jealousy? Is there envy? Do you fly off the handle in a fit of rage? I can't imagine that we all have a clean conscience on all of these things. Because until we reach heaven, we will experience the battle between the flesh and the spirit. There is a battle, and there will always be that battle. Though the good news is that the power of the flesh will decrease as we become more like Christ. We call this process sanctification. That's one of those religious sounding words, which means that in believers, there is a progressive work of God making us more like Christ. And one day the flesh will disappear. Philippians 3:21 tells us that one day our lowly bodies will be transformed to be like his glorious body. But in the meantime, we have a battle. And sometimes I think we settle for, sure, that's just me kind of attitude. That's what I'm like. And we don't worry about becoming more like Christ in all of these things. We don't worry so much about the jealousy, the selfishness, the anger, because the other things in that list are more serious and they're not us. But we don't have the freedom to pick and choose, do we? While all the freedom we have as Christians, we're not free from moral law to do as we please and just rely on God's grace to forgive us. We must be looking for the fruit of the Spirit. In verse 42, we see these things. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And it says there's no law against these things. If these things are increasing, we have evidence of sanctification. We are becoming more like Christ. So we've looked at what freedom means. We've looked at what we're not free to do. And now we want to look at what we are free to do. We're free to serve one another humbly in love. You know what a paradox is? One dictionary definition defines it as this: a situation or statement that seems impossible or difficult to understand because it contains two opposite facts or characteristics. I don't know if you have come across in an exam or a legal document the words "this page intentionally left blank." It's a bit of a paradox because actually it's not blank, as those words are on it. Or perhaps you've heard someone saying, "As I've said before, I never repeat myself." Now, there are lots of really deep philosophical paradoxes, but they're too much for my brain. The intentionally blank page one is tricky enough for me, and I blame it for not doing as well in exams that I could have, as I sat confused looking at this blank or not blank page. We have an apparent paradox in this passage, don't we? We have freedom. Freedom to do what? To serve. You were called to freedom. Now use that freedom to serve. So a question: why is love which serves others the way Christian freedom can express itself? Why does our call to be free and our call to serve others in love go together? The great passage about love in 1 Corinthians 13 says, "Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs." Some of that sound familiar. It certainly sounds in essence like the opposite of what the acts of the flesh are that we mentioned earlier. So how do we as Christians truly serve one another? Maybe we immediately think of the practical things that we do. Remember when we used to be able to have tea and coffee after church? I'm sure those people that were doing that out of a sense of love for the church. There was certainly nothing to be gained selfishly by doing that, by getting down early, setting up, serving others, tidying up. And there are many other examples like that. As a church, we have a lot of people who volunteer and muck in. Abbott's Cross, we get the job done. But I think it's more than that. It is those things, but it's more. In the next chapter of Galatians, in chapter 6, verses 1 to 2, it says, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourself, for you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." Verse 1 obviously is about confronting someone caught in sin, which doesn't give us a license to confront anyone we see sinning in any way. And we're not to be quick to criticize and tell people about their faults. 1 Peter 4 verse 8 talks about love covering over a multitude of sins. So this is really talking about a habit of sinful behavior and how we are to restore people gently. But verse 2 goes on to say, carry each other's burdens. And I think by taking this verse along with what we're looking at in 5:13 to 14, which are linked by the phrase fulfilling the law, which takes us on to our next statement, we can say that to serve one another in love means to carry each other's burdens. We're not to let people carry their burdens alone. What do we mean by burdens? This can be the responsibilities that people have in life, raising children or caring responsibilities, for example, or it can be an illness or a difficulty, a problem. And I think it's very helpful for Paul to describe them as burdens, as it helps us to understand how, as Christians, we are to serve one another. If you imagine someone literally carrying a heavy weight, a bag, a burden, how are you going to help them with that? You're going to help them by getting close to them, walking with them, putting your own strength under the burden, distributing the weight, lightening the load on the other person. To do that, we need to listen and understand, to physically, emotionally, spiritually take some of the burden off people. So how can we help people carry their burdens? I know many of you are doing this in many different ways, and certainly we can do this by praying for people, by getting alongside people. And that tea and coffee after church used to facilitate a lot of opportunity for that, to be a listening ear, to share your life experiences, to encourage, to give up your time, to do things for people, and to help practically when appropriate. Abbott's Cross, you're great at that. I think of those times of crisis when people make meals for individuals and families that are under stress as one example. What else can you do? What else can we as a church do to help people carry their burdens? That's a question you can consider further at the end. As we come towards the end, we want to look briefly at the two-part incentive in verses 14 and 15, the incentive to live this way. And we've already been looking at verse 14, and the positive part of the incentive is for the entire law is fulfilled in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. This is not a command to love yourself. You probably know that, because we already feed ourselves when we get hungry. We know what it means to have a job, to have an income. We know what it means to want to do well for ourselves in school, at university. We know what it means when we're glad our car is working well enough to take us up the north coast. We know that desire to play the whole of the football match and do well. We know what it is like to know Christ. And so this is a command to take our naturally already existing love to make it how we measure our love for others. And it can be tough because it means we want to feed the hungry as much as we want to feed ourselves when we get hungry. It means we want our neighbour to get a job and have an income as much as you're glad you have a job. It means we want our classmates, our fellow students to get A's or be recognised in school as much as you want. It means we want to help the person who is sitting in a broken down car at the side of the road as much as you are glad you're driving without care up to the north coast. It means we want our teammates on our football team to play as much as we want to play the whole game. It means we should want to share Christ with others as much as you are glad you know Christ. Imagine what it would be like if we, the church, served others like this. Imagine if we used all the energy we use on ourselves to serve others. Imagine if we cared about what happens to others as much as we care about what happens to ourselves. What an impact that would have in this world around us. The alternative is tragic. If we don't serve one another, it says in verse 15, it will be devastating. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Or as the ESV says, consumed by one another. Not a very pleasant one another. Be consumed by one another is not going to be part of this series. A church of people who do not serve each other in love will destroy itself. I don't think that is what it's like in Abbott's Cross, but we do need to pray that we do more and more of the serving one another in love. We serve in love because we were called to be free. And I'll finish with the question we had at the start. What would you do with that freedom?